Okay, I think I need to paste the thing while she's pumping because she's got a baby. Luckily, just the raw fuckery of life is overtaking all our carefully laid plans.
Thank God.
Yeah. I know how to do this. Nope, that won't work. But this will. There we go. All right, we are live. Boom. Fantastic. Let's mute that. Yeah. So happy to have you here.
Yeah, it's exciting. Also, just a pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. I hope people heard our pre-show banter because that's the gems right there.
Yeah, that's definitely the new aesthetic. I do so many podcasts, and I really resist this tendency to like over professionalize it and make it look more like television, because you like want to catch a conversation midway through and you want somebody's cat walking in front of the screen. Like, that's the emerging style as far as I can tell.
Yeah. So let's see. I think we could there's a bunch of places we can go. I have a bunch of things I'm curious about, but I love you being at the start as a kind of framing for the whole site. Like this, you're our official launch event, and you're like, okay, wait, there's something here. We could call it a meta crisis, a meta chrysalis, a sense making evolution, revolution, breakdown. All of those things matter. All those things don't. And I think you're the perfect shaman to initiate us into something that I don't even know what it is. So let's start with that, and then I'll be tracking the threads and seeing stuff. And if you want to type something, I can paste that. If you want to talk. We'll start there.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Gordon, people of Gotham. The first thing that comes up for me is the terminology. Like, what's a metacrisis? I think it's important to always give ourselves a moment to hate prefixes in general and the prefix meta in particular. Like, we only use the term because it's already in use. There are some ways to say it's a better term than polycrisis because it points to the scale and the internal and external transformation and the common set of drivers that underlie the collective set of crises we face. So maybe a metacrisis is better than a polycrisis. Maybe crisis is a good term. Maybe crisis is an opportunity. Maybe crisis is a term that scares our brains and misleads us about the situation. So it doesn't really matter what we call it, but we're looking at something that has a whole bunch of emergent accumulating problems across different domains that seem to have some common roots. Each one of them seems radical in terms of human stability and thriving, and also in terms of the potential transformation of life in the species. And it seems to be anchored in, I love that quote where people say, we've got Paleolithic emotions and feudal institutions and the technology of gods or some variant thereof. Because a lot of this problem goes back to just how we are as beings.
Yeah.
And then a lot of this problem goes to the way we've set society up for the last little while. And then a lot of these problems go to the new shit we've built that could change everything. And so you put those together and you've got a situation that makes everything seem weird and unpredictable and chaotic and radical and crisis-like in all directions. That's where we live now, and that's what we have to become good inhabitants of.
You were like referencing the kind of feudal institutions and like lizard brains. Somebody already commented about the kind of like answers being more apparent for low and middle income countries. And I think it's a kind of a cool way to ground this. Like you and I can riff on developmental theory and all sorts of non-dual epistemics and all sorts of crazy shit. But it's like, well, yeah, there's like a ton of people that are kind of coming into a global awareness at really, really different places of economic development in all countries, I guess. So how do you feel like that fits in, or can you riff on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing, because you have, on the one hand, people that enter a system first sometimes see things about it that people who are in that system later don't see. But then people who are entering later in the process see how it's begun to unfold, right? If your country is just coming online as an industrial power, or just getting hooked up as a digital networking society of some kind, it may be very obvious to you what the first few levels of response to this need to be, just because you see everyone figuring it out in real time. You see the actual human needs, you see the actual ecological costs of the way we're setting things up. And I think there's a lot of humanizing power in that. I think there's a lot of moral clarity that comes from people who are not just entering the globalized system, but entering it in a way that is precarious for them precisely because of the drivers that have been dominating for some time now. The real economic issues, the real ecological issues, the real life and death stakes that are present in those situations often give people moral clarity. However, it's not exclusively the case that people who are on the front lines of this know what the solution sets are, right? They may be aware of the first few things we absolutely need to do just in order to stabilize under these conditions, right? And we need to, from more privileged social circumstances, let's say, or from more bloated countries, we need to really take that seriously, especially in our politics, in our day-to-day sensibilities. But there are things you only see from the 1,000-foot view as well, right? There are extremely abstract things. There are things that pertain to the way we're laying out our leading-edge technologies. And there are things that we've gone through as the more potent societies that we don't want the other societies to have to go through, and solutions that are further down the line in some of those ways that, I mean, this is a classic problem in general, right? Like, we often feel like there's something really trustworthy in our bodies, in our intuitions, in nature, in our inheritance, and in being the sort of on the ground nations and populations of the world. And that's absolutely true, but that's not an infallible source of information. We also need to supplement that with our largest, most abstract, most peculiar, greatest high wire acts of the mind, that kind of stuff. You need to do interesting triage when you're like a first responder, but it's also important to have people who are, like medical coaches for athletes or something. Like, you've got to push health forward, and you've also got to bring the back up at the same time. And if we just do one of those, I think we're not going to be able to grapple with this. And in some ways, that's a lot of what the problem is we often want to do this one side or another, which, to my way of thinking, is part of how the modern system, the capital system, whatever we want to call that, it's incredibly flexible. It's able to enfold almost anything, right? You can become a revolutionary today, and your neighbor is selling T-shirts about your revolution tomorrow. It works itself into the system. And one of the ways it does that is modernity is so good at making a dialectic engine, a positive and a negative terminal, two main political parties, a prosecutor and a defender. Right? It's a system that runs on these dualities. And so unless we can also grab both sides at the same time, our solutions aren't really going to be up to the scale and tempo of the system we're trying to transform.
Right. Awesome. So that's one of the ways that you're like, man, I love that. So some of these dualities that you named, and I'm just putting them in my language, are like the body and the mind. Which on a social level, you have the kind of like, you have this pre-industrial wisdom, for lack of a better term, and then you have like modernity, and so that you see this with like kind of Eastern medicine or alternative medicine and Western medicine, and they both do certain things really well, and other things just really, really poorly. You have that sense of like crisis first responder versus like deep cause. So sometimes you do need to stop the bleeding. Sometimes you need to find out and treat the original thing. And what are some of the ways that we have screwed this up as a developing society that you're like, okay, at least I don't know how to face the whole meta thing, but I know here's a few things that we could do better, that we can help other people coming into this.
Yeah, well, we're looking at a couple of big problems in the way we're running our system right now. And by we, I mean, I'm thinking mostly of North America, but it's also a more general problem than that. We're certainly allowing multinational corporations to play countries off against each other. We're allowing our democratic collective decision-making institutions to fundamentally fail to reflect the intelligence that's baked into the population and to the circumstances that we're in. We're not allowing our currencies and our economic structures in general to reflect the actual amount of work that's going into systems. So I think we can look at demonstrating the fact that certain approaches to running a system work or don't work when you're trying to operate at this level of complexity. I think you need, like one of the things America is demonstrating is that you need to have a much more resilient system to protect yourself against people who hijack the collective decision-making mechanism from within, both in the political sense and the economic sense, and also in the media sense. We're going to need much more powerful media sense-making tools as we go rushing forward into an era of technology that makes the data you encounter less and less reliable.
Yeah.
We're seeing the outcomes of relying on the types of currencies that are in play in the system and the types of reinforcement and distribution mechanisms that currently dominate our economic model that prioritize the movement of capital away from the areas where we would need to solve these problems. And accompanying that, from the more shamanic point of view, a tremendous fragmentation, polarization, shredding of the shared sacred civic fabric, right? So there have to be a restoration of a common sacred feeling cause across the population that feels meaningful enough that it trumps our existing differences in temperament, worldview, and situation.
Right. I love the way you said that. And I think of it as an American, I'm like, yeah, we need to be proud to be American again. And that doesn't mean that it puts any other country or way of being down, but it needs to mean something that we can stand by. And kind of a surprising outcome of that, I think, for a lot of hippies that I love to hang out with and consider myself, is that there's a place for kind of like, not quite shame, but maybe shame. There's a place to say, like, to use social pressure to actually like enforce a kind of standard. I don't know. What do you think about that? This is just coming.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we hang out in a bunch of developmental communities, and one of the premises of those communities is that these different adaptive layers of sense making that exist within human beings and also within social systems, although not in exactly the same way as they exist in our psychology, but those layers all have function and validity. And when you get a new one, the old ones don't go away. So we need to be able to draw upon and energize healthy versions of all of our systems, even if we think of them as lower or more primitive versions of what we're working on right now. You're not going to wish away the cognitive biases of human beings or the need for a large chunk of the population to feel embedded in a consistent mythic framework that makes sense to them. And part of that whole system, which we've had on this planet for a long time, is hierarchy, is shame, is conformity, is self-sacrificial rituals of various kinds, right? We've got to try to do that in a smarter and healthier way than it's sometimes gone, but we can't just throw it away because it undergirds a lot of our social systems and a lot of our own psychology.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me. So speaking of these developmental models, this is maybe a little in the weeds, but I think you've thought about this a lot. How do we assess the seemingly unaccessible? Like, according to these models, most people actually can't access the meaning-making structures to evaluate whether these models are even accurate. And so I'm like, yeah, how do you think about that? And how does AI change the picture, if at all?
Well, AI is a tremendous new tool. Computation in general is a tremendous new tool, which allows us to potentially process patterns that fall outside of our cognitive ability to make sense of, right? There are some arguments that the majority of the algorithms that constitute reality are actually complex enough that we wouldn't recognize them as being patterned in the first place.
Right.
So we need, that sort of puts us in an interesting situation. There's a book I love, H.G. Wells, the science fiction author from the turn of the century, the last century. His last book was called Mind at the End of Its Tether. And it was a book about, it's a short pamphlet saying, basically, we've gone as far as we can go with the rational, conscious, waking intellect. He was probably a bit too pessimistic, but there's something to that, right? We maybe are seeing the results of going as far as we can with the assumption and the particular cognitive toolkit we've been using. So what are the other ones we can avail ourselves of or ally ourselves with? Right, we need to be able to draw more on ecological intelligence, on subconscious intelligence, on collective intelligence, and also on computational intelligence. Because one of the things these new computational systems can do is move much faster than us and take larger chunks of data into account. So there may be all kinds of alternative practical models for economy, for physics, for even spirituality that are out there in the sea of possible patterns. But brains like these are just never going to be able to find them and compress them to the point that we can use them.
Yeah.
So we do have to rely on and train and aim these systems to try to mine the world of pattern space to see if there are alternative solutions to the ones that we're implementing right now.
So it's super cool. When I get a sense of your, like, I try to empathize with the way you're seeing things or kind of step into your point of view. I'm like, we have like human cognition, the kind of the normal thing that we think of, like the brain. And there's some other things people often think of, like the body, like my body is holding itself up in this chair without me thinking it. It's cognizing in a certain sense. But you're like, instead of seeing it, it's like, oh, there's humans and there's AIs and there's like before and there's after. You're like, there's this kind of plane or this field of different ways of making, of like, I don't know what you would say, making sense or interpreting data or what, but it's like, there's like intuitive, there's collective, there's computational, there's like human, there's animal, like and they're all kind of available to us in a way that we haven't really leaned into that hard. Some are ancient, some are modern. Is that kind of how you're seeing it or feeling into it?
Yeah, that's a great summary. And I think one of the things that comes up for me around that is how important it is to have that experience of yourself in order to understand that as the way the world operates. Right. So we're getting a lot of new information out of neuropsychology and cognitive sciences in the last couple of decades about the inherent plurality of the human psyche. Right. We're not God-given or market-given preset individuals who just reason in selfish interest, where it's an ecology in there. And that puts us in a situation that's much more akin to the ancient animistic view, right? Although there are naive elements to that view, we're not trying to regress, but we do have to take embodied, embedded, plural psychology into account and understand that we are, whether we think in more spiritual, abstract, metaphorical terms or more in just terms of how a nervous system is embedded in a body, multiple informational processing systems make us up. We have parts, we have emotional, mental, and physiological intelligences. We have conscious and subconscious. We have front and back of the brain, left and right of the nervous system. We have a whole suite of different developmental intelligences, if we want to look through that lens. So there's a whole panoply of systems in us. So first of all, recognizing experientially and theoretically that that's the case for yourself, and then taking up practices in life or deliberate internal work or both that try to generate more coherence among your fragmented or quasi-autonomous information systems. That puts you in the right internal position, I think, to look out at the world and go, oh, right, this is a complicated plurality. There's a interesting set of complementary intelligences that are needed. We need to be able to explore, amplify each of them, and work together to bring coherence or alignment or agreement between those. And that, in my view, like I tend to think that generates a surplus coherence, right? An extra quality of meaningfulness, which looks like spirit for the individual, looks like religious qualities for the collective. But essentially, we need more than enough coherence in order to mobilize outside of the patterns that we're embedded in. And we get that by increasing our ability to integrate the information processing options that are available to us.
I love it. Because you bring this kind of information theory orientation in some ways, and I think you described spirituality like you just said, but you have a name for this, and I wrote it down so that I could remember it. It's kind of like a theory that you're known for. Is that right? This kind of surplus sense making capacities actually kind of is, you're like, I think like this is kind of a bottom up way of describing what awakening or enlightenment, that not that these are good terms for anything that anyone experiences. Yeah,
I think actually in one of my first conversations with John Vervaeke years ago, he referred to what I was talking about as the integration surplus model of religion and spirituality. And I took it from him and started to use it because it's a good summary of one big block of what I've been working on that feeds into the rest of these ideas. And it's also something that came out of my own spiritual practice, and in particular my work in the Gurdjieff lineages, combined with the time I spent working on theory and social development in integral communities. Because if you take some of the ideas out of particular esoteric lineages that involve, say, bringing your mental, emotional, and physiological intelligences together to create a generalized beingness, you're like, well, that's pretty good phenomenologically. What does that actually mean? And what happens if we have more than 3 intelligence systems that we need to bring together?
Right.
So that's a very fertile way to begin thinking about this.
Yeah, the integration surplus theory. I think that's very, like when I think about my experience, that seems true. Like, and I don't know how much that's true in general, or that's true because I came into integral theory when I was very, very young. I can't step outside of my own view. And so, okay, but one question about that is like, how do you understand or explain the kind of shadow abuses, like these teachers that have a wild amount of integration surplus in some areas and then fail to, I don't know, act in somewhat obvious ethical ways? Like sometimes it's confusing because you're like, oh, well, they justify it as in service of spirit or spiritual teaching, and sometimes you're like, maybe it actually is, and I don't know. This is one of the areas that I feel metacrisis-y about.
Yeah, I mean, it's really good to think about that internally and externally as well, because you can get a lot of integration between some systems, but that doesn't mean you've integrated all the systems. And the ones you didn't integrate or didn't even think to check on for some reason, those are going to come back to bite you in the ass at some point, right? That's where our shadow material, our unintegrated stuff still exists. So when you think about an individual, for example, when you start to look at it through the lens of an integration surplus model, you can see how you might get a whole spiritual tradition, for example, around combining the physiological and the mental, right? So you've got these practices where people are trying to lead their body with intention, or they're trying to constantly mentally follow what their body is doing. And a lot of forms of dance, a lot of forms of martial arts, a lot of forms of yoga have this particular thing, and you get particular results, and those results are valid. But just because you're good at that doesn't mean you know much about your own emotional possibilities and sophistication. So you might get somebody else that's working a lot by combining their mental understanding with their heart, or their body with their heart. And that person doesn't necessarily know much about something else. It doesn't make them good at music. It doesn't necessarily make them good at ethics either, right? So there are all these ranges of understanding that we have to be able to develop on their own terms. We need some good map and some shared cultural ethos, which says try to include at least these basic modules of intelligence in the integration you're setting up. But we also have to leave room for people to be doing it experimentally in whichever ways are attractive to them, and handle that, contextualize that in a way that's relatively safe for people who are intrigued by it, right? So like you have these famous characters throughout history who have done something interesting to their nervous system, energy field, consciousness, whatever we think. And some of them are great, and some of them are dangerous predators in certain areas or just have huge blind spots.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they aren't interesting, doesn't mean you can't learn something from them. It would be nice if they had a slightly more contemporary ethical attitude. It would also be nice if people going to them understood that just because they're really good at this bit doesn't mean they're perfectly good at all things, and you have to be responsible for yourself and your safety and set up sensible protocols around them.
Yeah. I mean, it's exciting, and I'm nerding out a little because I mean, in a lot of ways, UpTrust, we touched on two of the big pieces of UpTrust that are unique. One is kind of separating out these systems. So being able to say, hey, I trust, or even if whatever you use the UpTrust or down button for, if it's like, or it doesn't matter, like it's kind of training epistemologically this difference. Like you can be really good at martial arts, and or for you, maybe it's you're really good at yoga and meditation, and maybe you're a really bad cook or car mechanic or something. I don't know. And these aren't quite the kind of deep systems that we're talking about, but they gesture in that direction of being able to see the plurality of each individual, so-called individual human being. And then this kind of dialectical synthesis of holding opposites is a big part of what we do here too. So I'm just like, this is perfect. I'm excited. I love it.
Yeah, I love that you point that out, because one of the interesting features of UpTrust, not to get too salesman-y about this, but being able to value different aspects of somebody's posts initially seems like a bunch of hassle and a bunch of extra work, and you're not totally sure what the subcategories mean, so you can get a little bit too mental about it. But the basic principle of an invitation to check yourself and say, which aspect of you, which sense-making system are you using to value this? Where are you finding value in this? That contributes to the possibility of a more complex sort of social networking and collective sense-making system, which is part of the technical response to something like the metacrisis that we need, right? There are a lot of trust is interesting, right? Trust has, in the integral terms, an intersubjective and an interobjective or systemic aspect to it. We do need to get better as people, trusting each other and being trustworthy, showing up in integrity, figuring out how to be together in ways that generate a sense of shared we that exceeds us and feels valuable, and toward which we voluntarily want to submit ourselves because it's so wonderful and satisfying and necessary feeling. That's super useful. But it doesn't necessarily solve the systemic problem of creating trust, meaning that our information protocols, our cultural artifacts, our institutions, our collective decision-making protocols, all of those have to also take us to a higher level of trust. And if we can't get that higher level of trust sort of across the board, then we aren't really going to be able to solve the metacrisis, because we'll always have a significant weak spot that can undermine the whole system or be vulnerable to predators and parasites that exist and are currently holding back a lot of the transformational potential of our civilization.
I want to double click on that. And God, there's so many ideas I want to double click on. I don't want to just go for the one that was most recent because it was the last utterance. Yeah, I mean, okay. So one thing that kind of lights up in me as you say that is I'm like, oh, one of the natures of development, I think, is this kind of like increasing embrace of these poles like you described. So one of them is like more autonomy and more communal or collectivism. And one of the ways that that's required, I think, to kind of face this crisis is like UpTrust is like stupidly ambitious. We're like, let's change the whole incentive landscape of conversation on the internet, or attention getting on the internet, the whole media. And as we talk about it, it's like obvious, like that takes this incredible ambition or drive or individuality but it's a tiny piece of the solution. And there's like, that's even that's like in one quadrant or a quadrant or two. And there's like 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 or 1,000 other incredibly ambitious projects that we all, it's like, yeah, I'm feeling the kind of ecosystemic nature of like a ton of people individually choosing to do and needing to rely on each other. Like I need to rely on like someone who's building like a distributed ledger type thing that I can run UpTrust on, and just on the systems level, but also need to rely on these innovations in governance and in sense making and in spirituality and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's a basic, and this goes partly to that comment about, what people know when they are just entering into the kind of global economy, whether that's us in history or whether it's other countries right now. There's a sensibility that they might still have around the obviousness of needing to rely on each other, needing to be trustworthy, needing to have maturational rights as a community, needing to be able to stand and take heroic sacrifices sometimes on behalf of your community and yourself and your family and your ecosystem against the seductions of the machinery around you, while at the same time understanding that that machinery is a legitimate form of empowerment, and that you don't want to just continue to exist in the same old way and suffer the same old disadvantages. But I think they are very often imbued with a stronger sense of the values that are necessary from the prior system that we might have lost track of from spending so much time in the new industrial and electronic form of reality.
Yeah. I feel like we're in a puberty. I mean, assuming we make it to adulthood, civilizationally, as a species, as a globe. And yeah, we'll see. I mean, it reminds me too of these graphs you see, like it'll be like happiness correlated with GDP, and there's like at first, low GDP, like medium happiness, and there's like 2 or 3 stages where the happiness goes down as GDP goes up, and then it goes way up. And so there's this sense that like someone will want to immigrate to a new country or bring in modernism to their, say, tribal land, and you're like, well, they fucked themselves for like 2 generations, but their grandkids are way better off in all the things that they were from their own culture previously valuing. There's kind of an interesting like lineage sacrifice in a way.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, first of all, there's the problem of local maxima in general. Like you might have to lose something to get to a higher, better something. And then there's this long range problem, which is, that might actually be better down the road. But what are the accumulating externalities that produces? And that's what we're looking at largely as the metacrisis, I think, is the accumulating externalities of the modern system, that the modern system itself can't solve because they are produced by its tactical strategies, right? It's technical efficiencies. When they are aimed at those problems, they solve them a little bit and then regenerate the problem, and you end up in what some people call hypermodernity, as opposed to like a true postmodernism.
Right.
Sorry, what was the question? I got distracted by the word hypermodernity.
Yeah, well, let's go with your distraction. Let's go with your distraction. That's part of it, right? Like, it's because you have this hypermodernity. You have, the housing crisis, I think, is like my epochal version of this. You have like bundles of bundles of bundles of bundles of financial instruments of like eventually junk bonds or something. Like, I don't know. So there's this like weird hypermodernity, like abstraction, like US financial market thing that like ends up impacting the whole world in a weird way. But then at the same time, you have this like this rise of this pluralism, and people are recognizing like this multiple perspectives. And so with that, it's harder to lean into saying like, hey, that's not okay. And like, we're not going to do that because, it's, I don't know, I guess it's not for some reason, like we said, like from that mindset, like there's certain things that aren't okay. And one of them is to hold people accountable. So
there's if you take something like basic Darwinian mechanics and apply it to a lot of this, you're like, okay, there's some kind of constructive interplay between a proliferating set of experimental mutations and constraint that brings that back into alignment with needs and environments. Right. So we can apply that to our technology, to the whole noosphere and its relationship to the biosphere, which I think is an important contemporary shamanic consideration. But we have to look at the way we set up a society and the way we honor layers of increasing abstraction in our thinking and our systems and our economics as potentially the first wave of a really good process. but it's only going to be useful if it's constrained again to be adaptive to actual resources, actual human needs, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a classic alignment problem discussion in the last 10 years, which is mostly around how do we align AI tools with human safety, basically.
Yeah.
But there's much bigger alignment problems, which is how do you align the mind and the body, the individual and the community? How do you align the anthroposocial technological domain with the ecological domain? How do we align our ability to innovate new tools with the constraints that tend to make those tools operate in service to human and ecosystemic thriving?
Yes.
And those sort of like what you're talking about, the housing crisis, right? Housing is a real thing. It's on the ground. It's actual lives, actual buildings, and then packaged fractional iterations of that turned into a gambling mechanism. That is obviously abstracted too far away from the reality, right? The economy is operating relatively independently of the actual situation, which some people can make a ton of money off of, but it doesn't help incentivize the actual situation's wealth to increase.
So there's something interesting here about another polarity between a kind of like horizontal or pluralistic thinking, which is like even from the very beginning, you said like the polycrisis has this quality to it. There's like, and then the meta like introduces hierarchies, and both are true. Both are part of the thing. But yeah, there's something here with that, like the confusion about how those relate, and even how to define this. Like, what's the difference between one whole on another? Like, when does it do this versus this?
Yeah, there's even a bigger confusion, which is, so you have like in evolution, right? There's a set of horizontal adaptations, which is just how well do your mutations allow you and your descendants to fit to a particular niche. And we could say there's no real advancement in that. It's sort of trendlessly fluctuating. But once in a while, there is an adaptation that we might think of as being an adaptation to the broader reality niche, which allows that whole system to get enfolded in the production of a new regime, a new set of capacities and sense-making options. And then that becomes the stable platform from which you undertake your new experiments in horizontal adaptation. So we get this cosmological stack after a while. It's not apparent in every adaptation and every interaction, but there is some kind of metaphorical verticality and horizontality. But that, all of that doesn't tell us what's healthy and useful or not.
Right.
Because you can like set up a system. We can do this with AI right now. Like, all right, we're just going to make it go meta on meta on meta on meta and be super endlessly self-reflective, right? Is that the system we want? That's one of the functions we want to prioritize, but it doesn't tell us what healthy is. So we need to be able to clarify, in addition to stable adaptation and in addition to growth, what a health pathology axis looks like. So we can say, and tell our machines also, this is a more likely outcome for generalized thriving than this is according to whatever the logic of naturalness and thriving is that we're utilizing. And we haven't put a lot of time into that. Some of our ancestors did, right? The famous Greek notion of the golden ratio is one way of thinking about sages who weren't just interested in self-development and community meaning, but also wanted to produce a technical description of what beauty and naturalness and utility looks like. Right. And we can pick up that challenge, I think, and move forward. And our new computational tools may be able to help us do that in a number of ways. And then that also comes back to what we might call a shamanic task, because the symbol of the shaman is partly a person who's trying to wisely negotiate between the human and the ecological realm. And they both need to come together to produce something like naturalistic thriving in a distributed fashion. And one of the tasks of the shamanic intelligence today, quote unquote, is to try to figure out how we can computationally implement a more clear notion of what a desirable outcome state is for natural and human systems.
I love that. So I'm just typing in. The shamanic task is technically defining / computationally implementing a more clear notion of what a desirable outcome state is for the humans and the ecology. Is that right?
I mean, that can be very abstract, which is great for whoever's listening who's very abstract, but we can think about it in like super simple ways. If we think about a captcha system where you got to log in and they make you tell the computer what traffic lights are or which one's a bus, right? It's partly a login to test human, but it's also partly you're training the machines to know what a bus looks like from different angles in a fragmented view. Why are we just training it to recognize traffic lights, right? We could be using human prompts to say, what do you think is most sacred looking? Or which one looks most natural to you, right? And you can imagine a scenario where we had
Yes.
10 years and hundreds of millions of interactions to train the machine to be able to improvise pattern configurations that match our sense of what sacred or natural or thriving looks like. That could be a really very straightforward kind of tool we could work on.
Yeah, this is great. I mean, I'm really with you here. Like, this is, and so this speaks to, for me, like one of the questions, like we set up this kind of silly premise, like what's the metacrisis and how do we solve it as if it's solvable, or if it's as if it's a problem that needs solving versus something like, alchemical or processual or something. But one of the answers is, I think what you're saying is like, well, there's a willingness and ability for the people working on these things, building captchas for that matter, to think about the good. What are we aimed at and why? And then design processes not for just pure efficiency or cost or profit optimization, but kind of like flourishing optimization. And this is one example. So yeah, like what's beautiful, what's good. You could even imagine using a CAPTCHA style metaphorical thing to be like, what's good? What's more ethical? Like, you could, I don't think the trolley problem is the right abstraction here, but you could imagine introducing in CAPTCHA's trolley problems and trying to get people to train the machines to recognize, what human ethics look like.
Yeah, there's a field of architecture called parametricism now, right? And it draws on kind of Gaudi and Buckminster Fuller and also some more recent architects. But the premise is they can use computers to try to spin up best fit solutions between multiple interacting parameters, and they can give you a variety of different best fit solutions. And the interesting thing about those solutions, when you ask it about cost and materials and human utility and how it fits into ecosystems and that kind of stuff, the results are very futuristic and very archaic and very organic looking. They look much more like the results we get out of biomimicry when we look at the close molecular structures of parts of the ecosystem for solutions to human technical problems. There's a beautiful strangeness there. So we're already experimenting with ways where we might be able to produce not only a new aesthetic that's inspiring and interesting and changes the experience of the cultural landscape, but also pioneering ways to start generating something that solves a lot of problems at the same time and gives us the kind of futuristic and archaic and organic aesthetic that our hearts seem to be starving for, in which the modern layout doesn't really provide us, right? It's not very, once in a while, when I was a kid, I remember seeing the space shuttle take off from Florida, and you're like, oh my God, this is like being at the pyramids, right? There's a tremendous monolithic awe, right? You're beholding something vast and great. And so there are these beautiful aesthetic peak experiences that are possible from our participation in modernity. But by and large, when you look at highways and parking lots and a contemporary sewage station compared to a sewage station from the 1800s, it looks like an aesthetic disaster.
Yeah.
And part of that is that we are not using the best version of our contemporary tools to spin up structures that meet our sensibility relative to both function and fitting into ecological, naturalistic anticipations about thriving that are built into our brains.
I could go on and on about this. I've looked a little bit at some ethical kind of contemporary moral realism that talks about this kind of thing. But I wanted to bring in, there's a comment from Julielle Layman, please define your we. This conversation thus far hasn't presented an invitation, and it seems to focus more on the unknown we needs to develop to cultivate in the us or they to what we become. So what's your we?
Yeah, great question. And it operates simultaneously on multiple levels. I think probably in this discussion, I've used we most commonly to mean the human species in general, as if it was a collective entity trying to face existential problems that exceed whatever the local, cultural, and personal situations are. But sometimes I will also use a we to mean something like the overlapping transformational, developmental, and regenerative networks, right? There are a cluster of communities that prioritize certain values, prioritize certain practices, and are trying to come together globally to look at these kinds of problems. I'm in service to that subculture, let's say, a lot. So sometimes I'll mean that, but the rest of the time I will mean an aspirational notion of the species.
And how do you, that second definition can be seen as elitist? What do you think? Is it elitist? Are we elitist?
I don't think there's much of a problem with the concept of elitism. I think we should try to be elite. I think there's it's different than being an asshole, right? You could be a good elitist in a lot of ways, and we want people to specialize in things, right? And then we want them to come back and tell everybody, but we don't want them to be beholden to the idea that they have to be immediately simple and generally comprehensible to everyone. So I think we do want elites. A big problem that we face now is seemingly that our elites are not elite. I watched this documentary last year about the Australian Elite Special Forces, which is their official name, and how they were kind of hazing and indoctrinating new soldiers in Afghanistan by just having them shoot Afghani civilians. And you look at it, you're like, that's not elite. That's actually really, in my sensibility, really low, right? That was a really crass, crude, dysfunctional way to go about things.
Yeah.
So I would like there to be a system in which we could count on elites more.
Yeah.
Both in terms of technical functions, like I want the most elite physicists and the most elite generals and all that kind of stuff, but also in terms of people who are pushing forward to different kinds of philosophical and psychological capacities. Right? And there's different, the elites, I think, need to be affirmed and encouraged and supported, but that's not the same as giving them an unnecessary or exaggerated status, power, and influence in society necessarily. They have to be appropriately elite. This is another problem that we've come to as part of the, when we look at drivers of the metacrisis, which is often a way of saying what are the subfunctions of modernity that are producing these effects. And one of those subfunctions is we're very often blind to the functional fit of the merit in our meritocracies.
Yeah.
Right. And the example I always give is you could have crashed the American economy in 2008 because you're a terrible banker. And then you got a bailout from tax money, and then you went right back to work running another bank.
Yes.
Right. And so is that merit in a meritocracy? In some ways, yes. You have some skills. You didn't get there for no reason. But what skills are they? Right. You have the skill of avoiding the consequences of your own bad decisions. You have the skill of getting people to pay you. You have the skill of convincing people that you have some kind of authority. Those are real skills. That's merit. But it's not the merit that's appropriate to running the economy.
Yes.
Right. So we have a meritocracy, but we don't have a mechanism for making sure the particular forms of merit match the skills and the task spaces in which we want that merit to be applied. So we need to get smart. We need like a meta elitism that like fits our elites to the areas in which they would be actually useful, and not just self-aggrandizing and increasing their hoard of the general resource share.
And it goes back to that question, that alignment question, like, okay, so which sub-processes do we want to select, and actually, what does it mean to flourish? What does it mean to have a good life? What does it mean to have a good society that aims at good things? So that reminds me, like, there's some way I'm like, in some ways I'm like, okay, you have this integration, we have an individual self-integration that leads to this surplus, which kind of leads to this flow state, or this joy, this high functioning. Imagining we could have that as a society, there's some sense in which its integration at its best is an embrace of pluralism. Like you're saying, like you have to see this plurality inside and outside and work with these systems and not try to reduce them to each other. At the same time, how much does ontological pluralism fuck up coordination?
Yeah, you've got to be handled in a smart way. I mean, the first thing is that we can't be naive about the plurality. We can't have a flatland pluralism that says just because pluralities are being honored doesn't mean that all contributions are equal under all conditions. It doesn't mean that you have the luxury of spending an endless amount of time getting everyone's view for consensus. Um, there's a constant negotiation between the combinatorial explosion that's possible in looking at the subfunctions and their subfunctions in a system, and the possibility of an overly simplified dogmatic response pattern. And we don't know where the sweet spot is between that. So what we need are processes that allow us to sway back and forth, negotiating the space between those. I think we can look at systems that are pretty good at doing that already. All right, and there are some human systems like that. There are also some ecological systems that are like that. But we have to make sure that we allow for locally functional hierarchical levels to the way we set up our pluralities, and then also constrain those to make sure that those particular hierarchies don't spill too far out of their appropriately applicable niche.
Right. Okay, we've got only a few minutes left, so you can do a wrap up, and just to make it harder for you, I'm throwing out thinking of this elitist question because it came in. I think you've done a good job also from what I've seen of like looking to not just like this kind of pluralism here or in the future or something, but also in the past. And one example of this is this idea of this like both and diunital cognition. And it's kind of, there's like roots in African epistemology or something. I don't know. Can you just touch on that briefly before we close?
Yeah. So there's a notion that's present in some philosophical and developmental systems. Ken Wilber summarized it as the both and kind of thinking, but he's not the only one that's done that approach. There have been a number of Black thinkers in particular that focused on diality, which is like it's a unity of two. It's very much like saying both and. How do you bring things together in a way that is actually integrated is an interesting question. So my friend Germain, who's like the voice of Black metamodernism and likes to use diunital rather than integration or something like that, he's very focused on how do we move beyond just oscillating back and forth in a dialectic relationship, which sort of reifies the double that's holding the system in place to an actual hybrid or synthetic solution of some kind. Right. So this is a little bit like how do you get beyond just pluralism into an actual coherent integrated pluralism of some kind? And there are ways we can look at. One of the ways is, I mean, they're interestingly linked, right? I don't think we want to undermine that duality as well, because you do have to go back and forth in order to find the ability to coordinate two different ends. And to some degree, that coordination is just a resonant coupling. Like if you're trying to make two neurons wire together by firing together, there's a little bit of physiological change that goes on, but a lot of it's just a signaling coordination. So these two things can become better at signaling, and they can reveal in their kind of mutual tension and their parallax a greater picture of reality that goes beyond just the sum of their parts, so to speak. The danger would be that you create communities that think they're integrative, think that they're meta-modern, and they're actually just people who constantly oscillate back and forth between two given perspectives that have been made available to them by their cultural background. So we don't want to be just stuck in an endlessly fluid shifting back and forth of people who never really take any position. You have to somehow bring those positions into a collaborative alignment that is functional and that you can act on, speak about, and make sense from as if it was kind of one thing, but not so much one thing that you lose the value and the information that's contained in their difference. So my philosophical approach, I often call the metaphysics of adjacency, because it's very much about how do you get things to like just the right amount of far away from each other. Very often when we talk about integration, or even when we talk about unity, we don't really want unification, right? I don't actually want to be one with my lover in the sense that our bodies are superimposed over each other and our pancreases have to occupy the same space. When I say I want to be one, I actually mean I want us to be close enough that an additional function that supersedes us is enacted. So you can think about any two cultural or psychological sense-making systems as being like that. How do you bring them into coordination enough so that they remain separate but also operate as if they're one thing, and that whole sort of paradox-like structure, that Zen-koan machinery of it, also tells you something that you couldn't have known by just moving back and forth between them. So that's diunitality.
Boom. I love it. That's a great place to end. We can go forever, and it's time to wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Layman. Thank you, everyone, for commenting and listening and watching. And the comments will stay open, and people can keep having this discussion. We need it. We need to keep having the discussion and doing it in a diunital and adjacent way where we disagree generatively. So thank you.
Yeah, I'll be able to like jump in and respond to a bunch of these throughout the day.
Anytime. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
Fantastic. This is fun. Neat to go first. I appreciate what you set up here, Jordan, and I